Dear God in heaven, we come before you this Sabbath morning, thanking you for another opportunity to study together. It's my prayer that we may be benefited by the discussion, conversation we're going to have concerning inspiration. May it be beneficial to each and every one of us as we wrestle to try and understand your will, your plans, your methods. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so today we're gonna go through a subject that I've been studying for a while. It's the Old and New Covenant, and I know I normally try and engage people as we go, but I'm not sure about the content that I'm going to cover today, so I'll actually approach this study a little differently today. Um, so I'll ask if people have questions or contributions that they write them down or something, and hold them until the latter part of the study. Hopefully, there'll still be time to tackle them because I want to be sure that I cover as much as I possibly can of this subject. Otherwise, um, yeah, I think if I do it the way I normally do, I won't get very far. And that also said, if there is a pressing question, like maybe I need to repeat something, wasn't clear, please do interrupt me. Otherwise, if it's other questions, if you could hold them to the end of the study. I can't see any hands, by the way, because I'm handling multiple screens. So, like I said, if it's a pressing one, just interrupt me. Otherwise, if it's more of a, I don't know, theological one or something of that sort, please hold it till the end. All right. So all the new covenants. This is a study that's based primarily off of um, two passages in Scripture. Galatians, two books. So Galatians, particularly chapters 3 and 4, and Hebrews. There's other verses, of course, and I will not be reading verses today. Um, I'll make the assumption that this is common knowledge because most of what we're going to cover is not anything new. The framing might be new, but the content itself is something we should be familiar with. It's a study that's common in Christianity, it's a study that has been done in Adventism, and a study that has been done in this movement. I think Elder Paminda has actually tackled this subject. So Hebrews, I think it's 8 and 10, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but like I said, there's other passages as well. So these are my primary sources for what I will share with you today. Primary sources, Galatians 3 and Hebrews. All right, so what we'll start with is an outline, a list of the properties or characteristics of each covenant. So we'll start with the Old Covenant. The properties that the Bible gives us about what an Old Covenant is, um, how to identify an Old Covenant. And this is, of course, centered on ancient Israel because the Bible was a Jewish document, a Hebrew document on the most part. I think there's one or two people that were not Hebrews that contributed to the writing, but otherwise it's a largely Israel-centered document, even though we extract principles and lessons that apply to all people. So this is what the Bible writers say about the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Bearing in mind that this was all revolved around Israel. But the reason we are studying this is because we want to see how this can inform us and help us to understand our experience with God. All right, so property number one is that the old covenant is temporary, right? Temporary meaning it's bound by time. It's time bound covenant. And it is repetitive. So what repetitive means is you have to keep doing the same thing over and over again, I guess to achieve the same result. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. One of the things that were part of the old covenant were the feast, right? The Hebrew feast. And if you think about the feast, these feasts had to be done on a yearly basis. You had to have Passover, Pentecost, you had to have the Feast of Weeks, you had to have the first fruits, etc. You know, these ceremonies and these feasts, they had to happen yearly. And another one, which is probably even more repetitive than that, is the killing of the lambs. You had to kill a lamb every day, if you can conceptualize that. So that's what I mean by repetitive. You had to keep doing this thing in order to maintain the covenant, in order to be part of it. So the lamb had to be slain on a daily basis for the covenant to remain alive. Um, but this was not going to be the case forever. So that's why I put the word temporary there. It's bound by time. It has a specific time associated with it. And when that time expires, that covenant is set aside. It's dispensed of. Okay. And then it's examples based. That's another characteristic. And examples based, like I said, if you think of lamb, if you think of first fruits, all these were examples to teach something, right? So John in the New Testament will tell you that the lamb is Jesus, and Paul will tell you that the first fruits is Jesus. You know, um, Jesus became the first fruits of them that slept, Paul said. So these were just examples of things to come, if we can say. So it's an examples-based covenant. It's not the real thing. Um, the other part of the covenant is it's conditional, right? And what conditional means, the way I understand it at least, I'll put it this way. Blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. Hopefully we can conceptualize that. All right, that's what I mean by conditional. I mean, more can be said about it, but basically that's what I mean. Blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. I don't know why my handwriting just changed to Charity's handwriting. Anyway, that's what conditional means, right? There's more to it, because we'll probably get into it later. The other property is that it's a stopgap. So what do I mean by stopgap? Uh, if you've ever heard of this term, I'm sure you have, plan B. If things go wrong, you introduce a plan B. So this was not the original intent. So I'll say not original intent. And if you ask me where I get that from, Galatians chapter 3. Um, what Paul will say in Galatians chapter 3 is that the law was given or added because of transgressions. And what he means by the law is this old covenant, which was established at Sinai, right? So they are given Ten Commandments and they're given this book of the law. And Paul says the reason they were given all of that is because of transgressions, right? That wasn't the original intent. In the same chapter, I think, either the same chapter or the next chapter, chapter 4, he will say the law was a schoolmaster. I think it's the same chapter, Galatians 3. He'll tell you that the law was a schoolmaster to bring the church, God's people, to Christ, to a knowledge of Christ. And what he means by knowledge of Christ is a knowledge of equality, because in the following verses, he then says, where there is neither Jew nor Greek, free nor bond, male or female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. So it's talking about equality. Right, so this was meant to help them because of their situation. And what their situation was, what transgressions is, I'm saying, transgressions. It's not necessarily that, individual people were sinning because they were, but that's not the point. The transgressions that Paul was talking about is the mindset. They're the mindset of slaves. So the slave mindset, you could also say the pagan mindset, right? They had been in Egypt for 215 years and they were affected by that, right? So if you picture children of Israel, yeah. So this period here, oh, sorry. This period here, I'll just call it the 400 years that Jesus calls it the 400 years. Not Jesus, sorry. Well, it is Jesus, but in the Old Testament, God says 400 years there'll be sojourners. And then what you have at the end of it is the Exodus, right? They're delivered. So this period here is the period of transgressions. In our reform line, we don't call it transgressions. We normally refer to it as a period of darkness. So we call it period of darkness, right? And I'm saying it's a slave mindset. That's what Paul was talking about. So because they had been affected so much by this 400-year period, um, God couldn't enter into the covenant that they had entered into with Abraham. So Abraham's here at the beginning of the 400 years, and Abraham's relationship with God was that of a friend. Right? Abraham was a friend of God, we're told. But with Israel, the relationship that they established with God, I'll just call it master slave, right? It's a master slave relationship with a go between, with a mediator in between. So that's the other property of the old covenant is that you have a mediator. Mediator. And the mediator in this case, Sinai, was Moses. He's the one that would speak to God and then take the information that God gives to him back to Israel and vice versa. Right. So that's about the old covenant. What I want to highlight a bit more, role of the mediator. I want to identify the role of the mediator. Um, so there's a couple of rules, but I will point out two uh, for simplicity. One of them, the first one, is to ensure compliance to the covenant. Ensure compliance to the covenant. Um, so there's two parties, and in this case, the two parties are God and Israel. Um, and part of what this involved was explaining the law, right? The terms of the covenant. So they had to explain the law or the terms of this covenant. That's the first rule. Second rule is reconciliation. Reconciliation. So if things go wrong and one party is not happy with the other, they had to try and bring the two parties together again. So there's reconciliation. So hopefully that makes sense. What we have is a mediator here, and then on either side, we've got the two parties. The one party is God, the other party is Israel, right? So this entity in the middle, this one here, becomes your conduit for communication. All right. So are there any questions about this section? And the questions I'm asking for is there anything that people missed that they might not have heard? That's the question I'm asking for. Okay, I'll take the silence as we are all together. So can someone just confirm that we are together?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Uh, moving on to the new covenant, properties of the new covenant. So the new covenant, in some ways, will obviously be contrasted to the old covenant. Whereas the old covenant was temporary, new covenant is permanent. So something happens once and its effect is felt, say, forever, right? It's permanent. So if I'm to use an example to picture this, uh, Paul will say in the book of Hebrews, I think it's Hebrews, that Christ died once for all, right? And then went into the heavenly sanctuary. So there was no need for Jesus to continually die. Um, right, so it's permanent. And the reason why it's permanent is unlike the old covenant that's based on examples, this one is based on principles. And once a principle is understood, it's unchanging. We know that principles do not change. They remain the same, they're constant from start to finish. They're the same forever. So it's a principle-based covenant. And because it's principle-based, there's a permanence to it. It can be permanent. Um, Third property is that it's unconditional, right? It's not conditional like the old covenant. So the way Paul will express this is Um, those that keep the law shall live by them. I never used to understood what I never used to understand what that meant, but I did a lot of searching, and the answer I came to in the end was what Paul was saying when he talked about living or life isn't just, temporary, um, temporary life, like being able to maintain your life, because you would lose your life, if you didn't follow most of the principles of this covenant. But what he was talking about is salvation. So there was a perception, and it's not that the Hebrews made it up. I think it was baked into the covenant. It gave that impression that if you actually do this thing, if you keep these laws, you will last forever as a nation. Jerusalem will stand forever, Jeremiah says. At least God says through Jeremiah. So there was this impression that, doing all the words that are written in this book of the law would ensure what we normally term salvation. It would ensure that they stand forever, live forever. And Paul says that couldn't be further from the truth. It was never the case. Even under the old covenant, it was never the case, but the old covenant had to be presented that way because, again, of the way that the Hebrews viewed things, the way they understood things. So you end up having this stopgap or plan B that has to work with the people where they are. So it ends up communicating things in a way that is not, I'll say, 100% accurate. So the best example I could think of about this conditional nature, like I said, versus unconditional, is that statement that those that did the law would live by them. Um, and then Paul says the new covenant is not like that. The new covenant is based on uh, faith in Jesus Christ, in accepting the role that Jesus did. And what that meant in the uh, new covenant, when Paul would talk about having faith in Christ Jesus, accepting the role that Christ, um, let me write it down here. What accepting Christ meant, accepting the role of Christ as Messiah, accept Christ. Um, and there might be more to this, but put simply, what accept Christ equaled was accept authority of the church, the Christian church. That's what it meant. So you wouldn't just say, yeah, I like Jesus or I believe in Jesus. I'll do my own thing. Um, what Paul actually meant by accepting Christ and accepting the role of Christ is accept the authority of Christ. Um, and the authority of Christ is delegated to the church. So it's accept the church. And accepting the authority of the church basically uh, was sufficient to not only save you as an individual, because yes, you would be saved as an individual, but more than that, the case that Paul is making is that this church that has understood the principles that were encoded in the old covenant, is basically going to stand forever because it's based on principles. It it's based on a proper understanding of inspiration, of the government of God, the law of God. And this is what's going to ensure the security and safety of everyone from now until forever. That's why Paul was saying that. And Paul understood quite a lot, even though not all of it could have been implemented in his time, but he understood a lot in his time. He actually understood, like I said earlier, we read Galatians chapter 3:28, that what all this was pointing to is equal rights under the law. Whether you are a Jew, or a Gentile, whether you are male or female, whether you are free or a slave. Um, this is what's going to keep everyone safe forever, right? So it was established a long time ago. Anyway, that's the story of unconditional. I'll come back to this, I think, a
Blessing.
little later. Yes.
You know, when you say unconditional accept Christ, is the authority, is that kind of like the order of Melchizedek, like because he was a symbol of Christ, and is it kind of like that or not?
So if you could
Because I
write
got
that
confused
down,
when you said church
yeah.
when
If
you
if you
church.
could if you could write that down, we could talk about it a little later. For now, I'll
Okay.
just keep it as church, and then we can talk about Melchizedek later. That's all right.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, okay, so I said it's unconditional. The other one was blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience. What I'm saying on this one is the church is built well. So Paul says because the church is built well, there's no condition, there's no conditionality. You're not going to have a situation where um, the kingdom will not last or it will not stand forever. It will stand forever. Whereas with the other one, it's, I'll say, largely dependent on the performance of Israel, of the people that were getting into covenant with God. And if they didn't do their part, if they did not fulfill the conditions of the covenant, then it would fall apart. But in this case, because of the work that Jesus did in setting up these principle-based institutions, you have an unconditionality. You can have confidence in these institutions, and they're not going to fall apart, and they are capable of meeting everyone's needs. Um, however, um, however, say bad you think you are, these institutions are capable of meeting your needs, meeting everyone's needs. Okay, so that's about unconditional. Then this was the original intent. The new covenant was the original intent, like I said, a direct relationship between God and the people, right? Original intent, it's God and the people. And therefore, because it's a direct relationship, you have the end of the mediator, this Moses-like mediator. Moses-like mediator, right? And what this simply means, because why I say Moses-like mediator is because Moses obviously died and was resurrected and taken to heaven, but the role continued after him. He still had people that would ensure compliance of the law of Moses. And without proving it, I'll just say those people were the prophets. So these Moses-like mediators, just say were the prophets. Prophets. If you think of Elijah, oh, terrible. Sorry about that. Anyway, um, the prophet's role or job function, simply put, was to go to the law of Moses and say, Israel, you are not keeping your end of the law. Make sure you keep your end of the law, because if you don't keep your end of the law, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to be punished, or you're going to be scattered, or something like that. But they would also go to God and say, God, you said when these conditions happen or when that happens, then you will do this. So fulfill your end of the agreement. Simple example, could be, this is a negative one, but it is a simple example. Elijah goes to Ahab and says, there will be no rain except at my word. what he was basically saying is that you said in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy that if you're not keeping the covenant, you're going to make the heaven as iron and the earth as brass. Maybe I mixed the two up, but something of that nature. So fulfill your end of the agreement. So that was the job. It's basically to ensure compliance to the covenant, both on the part of God and the part of Israel. So when you get to the new covenant, you have this mediator role dispensed off. So what that means is when you get to the end, it means you have a different law. And so the law of Moses isn't what's being applied anymore. Different law applied, I'll say, because it's based on principles now. And what also happens, the other effect of that is prophet is no longer the individual. It's not Elijah and all those people. The prophet is now the church or the institution, right? So the whole institution becomes the prophet or fulfills the role of the prophet. So how Paul phrased this, well, it's not Paul, it's Jeremiah who gave it to Paul, and Jeremiah got it from God, is that they shall no man teach you, saying, Know the Lord. And when it says, They shall no man teach you, saying, Know the Lord, what that means is the mediator stops doing their job. They basically remove, they become redundant, if we can say. You're not going to need a mediator anymore. That's the equivalent of they shall no man teach you saying know the Lord, because under the old covenant, the one who would teach you to say know the Lord is the mediator, Moses and Moses's successors. We can call them that, right? So now, the relationship that Moses had with God, the church has with God. So you now have a situation where everyone can know the Lord. Everyone can understand. And the reason why everyone can know the Lord and everyone can understand again comes back to this point here, point number two, which is really a subset of these 3 points. The permanence and the unconditionality is all revolving around these principles. Once you have robust principles, institutions set up, there's a continuity that transcends individual people, right? Um, you can have so many people, everyone basically, in your covenant promises. Everyone is capable of understanding the truth because everyone can go to this, I'll call it unbiased rules book or principles book, if you can picture it as a book, and measure whatever they want to understand against it. And they'll come to the correct answer. So if everyone uses the same rules in the same way, I'll say they'll get to the same answer. So there's um, institutional integrity, which is which is why you don't need a mediator anymore, which is why the old covenant was temporary, because it's to bring the kingdom or the church to that point where you have institutional integrity. And when you have institutional integrity, which is this principle-based covenant, then it's permanent, it's unconditional, you don't need a mediator, and everyone will know the Lord for themselves. Um, of course, when I say for themselves, I'm not suggesting that you don't have the need of teachers, because we do understand that even in a perfect world, people have different uh, abilities or capabilities, however we want to call it, whether they be physical, intellectual, etc. But the point is, uh, the fate of the kingdom does not rest on an individual person. It rests on the integrity of rules, principles, and organization. This is what keeps everything and everyone safe. That's the point. Let's pause here again and ask if people are still with me on the new covenant, principles of the new covenant. Someone to confirm or deny?
Blessing.
Yes.
Like the principles or who gives those? Each teacher, each individual of the church back then? Because to me, it looked like it was just like Paul or the disciples. Well, not even the disciples, but Paul wasn't.
So what I'll say is the principles were actually encoded in the covenant itself, the Old Covenant. So they read the Old Testament. The Old Testament has the principles, but they just need to be extracted. So yeah, that's the principles were not made up per se, but they were extracted from a source document, and the source document was the Old Covenant or the Old Testament. Uh, so are we together
But
so far?
I must be misunderstanding. I thought it was a new covenant, a new thing. How it's different. No.
Yes. Could we
Yes.
pick it up later? If you can write it down, pick it up with you later. I just want to know if people have followed what I've said so far. Um,
Yes.
okay. All right. So what I want to do now is I want to talk a bit about Abraham, uh, comparing the old and the new covenant, the idea of Abraham being the friend of God, um, the unconditionality of the covenant, and stuff like that. That's what I want to talk about now because I had said at the beginning, somewhere close to the beginning, that this covenant, the old covenant, was a stopgap. It was plan B. So I want to talk a bit about that. So Genesis 15. And the reason why I pick up Genesis 15 is because in those references that I gave, um, Galatians and Hebrews, I think it's in Galatians, Paul speaks of Abraham. So that's how I was led back to Genesis 15, because Genesis 15 is God entering into covenant with Abraham. So what happens in Genesis 15 is Abraham is told to get some animals, and I'm going to draw a really, you know, bad animal. If you just accept that this is an animal, right? This is the carcass of an animal, if carcass is the right word. But this is an animal that has been split into two parts, right? This is your animal. There were a number of animals. It wasn't just one. There were birds, I think a cow and a few other things. Don't remember everything. Um, and you've got two people. So you've got God on the one side, I'll say, and Abraham on the other side. So this is Abraham, and this is God, right? So what God was doing here by instructing Abraham to do this was something that Abraham was very familiar with. This was an ancient covenant ritual that wasn't limited to God and Abraham. It was a common practice, right? So it's ancient ritual, ancient covenant ritual, which was done by kings, ancient covenant ritual, yeah. And it was normally done by kings and I'll say, call them rich people, but you think chiefs, leaders in society, right? People that had wealth or estate. So they would enter into covenant, these two kings or these two people. And because you had, I'll say, very limited enforcement mechanisms back then, you didn't have the sophisticated legal system that we have today, taking people to court, having binding documents that can be used against you in a court of law, being put in jail, having your wealth or portion of it confiscated in accordance with the law. You didn't have all of that back then. So what they did to compensate for that was invoke religion, right? So they invoked the gods, but this was really invoked the gods and the reason for this was to ensure, I'll say, compliance, right? To make sure that people mean what they say when they enter into this thing, to ensure compliance, right? Um, and what ripping the animal in two and then walking in between the animals meant. So the person on one end here would walk through these pieces, and the other person would do the same. So what they were basically saying symbolically, these people, is that may the gods do this to me, that is, split me and my kingdom in two, rip it apart, if I do not keep my word in this covenant. Excuse me. Does that make sense? If people followed what I said, because I know I said quite a bit, so I'll check in with you just to be sure you understood what I said.
Could you repeat it, Blessing?
Sure. So, like I said, this is an ancient ritual that was entered into by kings and movers and shakers in society, rich people, people that had wealth. And because you had, I'll say, a very limited legal system back then, they used religion to compensate for it. So they invoked the gods, um, and they used blood to ratify covenants. And this was all symbolic. And in this particular case, they killed the animal and then they split them. And when they would split them, both parties that are entering into this agreement would walk in between these animal pieces. So the one on the one end would walk through, and then the other one on the other end would also walk through. And what they're committing to, what they are communicating by doing that is, if I break this covenant, may the gods kill me and rend my kingdom, split it. Basically, I will lose my life and I'll lose my wealth or I'll lose my kingdom. That's what they were communicating by performing this ritual. Um, have people followed that, understood that? So this is information you will not find in the scriptures. It's extra information from history.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. So now the curious thing about Genesis 15 is that only God walked through the pieces. So Abraham didn't. Only God walked through these pieces, these split animal pieces, in the form of a burning lamp and smoking furnace, the Bible says. And I don't know if Paul specifically comments on the burning lamp and smoking furnace. He might not have. But in the book of Hebrews, I know for sure, and maybe in Galatians, it's just been a while, so I haven't quite read the verses. What Paul will use is this term that God swore by themselves. because they could swear by no other, by themselves. Oof.
So amongst the Godhead.
God swore by themselves and by no other. Right. And no other. So you use this phrase a couple of times. And what Paul is actually referring to is Genesis 15. That normally these kings or rich people would swear by the gods. They would invoke the gods and say, the gods will do this to me if things don't work out. So they swear by some higher power. But because God was the highest power, effectively, couldn't swear by anyone else and swore by themselves, by no other, that they would fulfill this covenant. So only God passed through um, these split animals. And what God was basically communicating by performing this act, which was an unusual act, is that this covenant is not going to be dependent on or based on Abraham's performance, right? So God only, not Abraham, right? It's not going to be based on Abraham's performance. Remember, the old covenant says, I can put them side by side. You got the old covenant here, and then the new covenant here. Um, this one says, obedience is what ensures life. And again, I said this life is not just individual life, it's the life of the kingdom, right? Um, and it's conditional, right? New covenant, on the other hand, Paul says Christ ensures life or the life of the kingdom. And I basically say Christ is a shortcut for the institutions of Christianity, of the Christian church, right? Christ equals life is unconditional, right? So what God is saying here is that this covenant is not going to be based on your performance, not going to be based on your obedience. So it's not that God was encouraging disobedience, right? But God is making the point that it's not your performance that's going to make things work, but that's going to keep things safe and stable forever, for eternity. Um, I'm gonna do it, basically. I'm the only one who can do it, if I can say. And the reason why God is the only one that can do it, well, maybe there's a better reason. But the reason that I know now that I understand is that God is basing this covenant, this relationship, this kingdom on right principles, principles that they understand well. Um, so that's the answer I'll give. The principles that God understands well. And God says, by passing through these animals, if I actually don't do this, if I don't make sure that there is a kingdom based on right principles that's going to keep everyone safe, what's at stake is my kingdom. I'll lose everything. So God is saying this is a life and death issue. but it's not life and death because of you. Like you don't make the stakes life and death. It's the the kingdom that's at stake, right? So there's the issue of the kingdom that's at stake. And if I don't do this, I'll lose my kingdom. And because I don't want to lose my kingdom, it's God speaking, I will definitely do this. So it becomes an unconditional covenant because what's at stake is God's kingdom. Did people follow what I just said?
Um,
Do they want me to repeat?
Not just repeat. Can you
Yeah.
say it in a way that's a bit more clearer?
Oh,
Like when you, oh, sorry, I hope you're okay. Um,
yes, I just needed to stretch my legs.
um, when you say God's kingdom is at stake, the
Yeah.
God that's walking through there, is it the same God that's the representative of the kingdom? Does my question make sense?
No, I don't think I
So,
get the question.
so God is gonna walk through that, and he's saying there's a kingdom that's at stake here.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do this thing to protect that thing that's at stake.
Yeah.
Um, and you, at least what I understood you're saying as those are, if you can conceptualize it, two separate things. There's God's kingdom, and then there's God walking through the thing. Why? My question is, why does God have to walk through that thing to protect the kingdom?
Okay, hold that thought.
Okay,
We'll come back to it. We'll
okay,
come back to it.
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, can you
All
repeat what you
right.
said anyway for the benefit of everyone else?
Okay. That's fine. Um, so what I said is you have God walking through these animals, which to ancient kings basically said, if I don't perform this covenant, um, this is what's going to happen to my kingdom. It's going to be destroyed or taken away from me. And God is communicating the same thing. Um, Abraham has nothing to lose. God has everything to lose. That's what God is saying. And because God has everything to lose, then God is going to become the guarantor of this um, covenant. That's a summary of what I said. Have people caught that? Followed it?
Yes.
Okay. Was that, did someone want to say something?
Yes. You said yes.
Oh, I thought after you said yes, someone said
I
something.
also said yes.
Ah, okay. You said yes. I didn't hear the yes. Okay. All right. Um, so what I want to do now is I want to deal with time. So we've been mainly dealing with the properties, just the principles, the what makes up an old covenant, what makes up a new covenant, right? And we spoke a bit about the conditionality and unconditionality. Conditional, basically meaning, the performance of both parties is essential to keep this thing going. Um, but in the new covenant, the performance of one party becomes essential to ensuring that, say, the kingdom lasts forever. Right. So now we're going to draw a timeline, put this on a line. For the history of the Old Covenant, ancient Israel. All right, so this is the beginning. And in the beginning of ancient Israel, so the Alpha history of ancient Israel, you've got the law given at Sinai. This is your Old Covenant, where it all begins. And this old covenant is going to extend all the way to 34 CE, the stoning of Stephen. Right? So that's the time span of the old covenant. The new covenant, on the other hand, will have two histories associated with it. So the first history, where it begins, is the time of the exile, which is the time when they got out of Babylon. Right? And it's not complete there. It's only complete when you get to the time when Jesus comes, right? And the rise of Christianity. So this is starting point for the new covenant. And it's going to extend up to here and beyond. So I want you to think it ends there. It extends beyond that. Yeah. All right. So when Jeremiah said, and Jeremiah lived in this time period here and into this time, I guess. No, 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 no. The 70-year period. Forget that. He lived in this time period here. This is where you have Jeremiah before the 70 years ended. And so you have Jeremiah. And what Jeremiah says is you're going to have a new covenant. I'll give you a new heart and a new mind. Right. And basically, no one shall teach you to say know the Lord because everyone's going to know me. And it sounds really nice, right? But in my opinion, what I think is that it in reality, in fulfillment, at the beginning, it was not as nice as it sounded. It was not as romantic, if I can say, as it sounded, right? So what happens to Israel after they come out of um, Babylon is they have no kings. The system of the kings was destroyed at the end of the reign of Zedekiah. So you're not going to have kings anymore. So they have no independent kingdom. Simply put, no independence. Say so, no independent kingdom, and it's going to force them to start organizing around a religious identity because they'd always organized around a political identity with their kings and their territory and all that. So they're now organizing around religion, so religious identity. So just to take a step back for a moment so that this point is clear. Before you get to this time where you have no kings anymore, um, I mean, the kings were the center of the show in Israel. And basically, they drove, say, domestic and foreign policy, interaction with other nations, and how their own nation was governed. And the downside of having the kings, especially, is that a lot of times, because of interaction with other nations, ancient Israel ended up uh, behaving itself like the other nations, even religiously. And the book of the law would be forgotten for long periods of time. It wouldn't even be read. It was lost at some point. If you remember Josiah's revival, there was a portion of the book of the law that had been buried somewhere. And when he was doing his cleanup of the nation and excavation campaigns, they came across this book, they read it, and they recognized, oh, if we don't actually keep these laws, we are going to be scattered. And it basically galvanizes the reform under Josiah, etc. I think we know that story. So sometimes we might take for granted that in the time of the kings, it was just business as usual, like it was in the time of the judges or in the time of Moses. But really, they were not paying attention to their religious identity, which was their primary identity. Their primary purpose of existence as a nation was not to be a temporal political kingdom that's just, jostling it around for power with uh, neighboring kingdoms. They were there to resolve a bigger issue relating to the great controversy, and they didn't pay attention to that. So, what God does to force them to pay attention, it's like God saying to John in the book of Revelation, take this book, eat it. It shall be in your mouth sweet as honey, and then it shall be bitter in your belly. There's an element there's an imperative that comes with it. So Israel is not voluntarily, because they love God, learning the law and having it in their hearts and their minds. That's not what's taking place after the uh, captivity. Yes, they have learned a lesson that, we shouldn't be engaged in idolatry because it gets us into trouble, but they don't understand anything, not anywhere close to how they're supposed to understand the law. So when it says that after the captivity of the 70 years, I'll put my law in your hearts and in your inward parts, what God was actually saying is, I'm going to force you to pay attention to your religious identity. And how they were forced to do that is their political situation. So they have no kings, they have no independence, and they now have a diaspora of Jews. So some Jews remained in Babylon and others went to Jerusalem. So what's going to connect these scattered people around? What's actually going to keep them a cohesive unit now cannot be political organization around a king and territory and a nation. It's their religious beliefs. So they start paying attention to their religious beliefs a whole lot more than they had ever done before, right? And that's what I mean by they organize around religious identity. And you see an emphasis on teaching in this history that wasn't there in previous history. So if you think about scribes, the role of scribes here was really elevated. Scribes had always existed, they would write information, etc. But here, scribes were not just documenting stuff, they were teaching and making Israel to understand the law, as the book of Ezra says, I think. Book of Ezra. So there's a lot of teaching. And what this does, the effect of this, is that it keeps the law at the forefront of their mind. So they don't understand it. They really don't. And there's evidence in how they're going to develop as a nation because they end up becoming, I'll say, very legalistic and Pharisaical. But there's more to the story than that. But what they do have now is they have all those prophecies and messages and laws. They're all in their mind. They pay attention to them. And why this was important was for the history that was going to come at the end. Because while they had the law at the forefront, they did not understand it, did not understand it, but they needed to have it. People needed to pay attention to it. It could not afford to be lost. Because when you get to the end now, when everything is fulfilled, right? Fullness of time, when you get to the fulfillment, this is when I'll say everyone knows. So everyone knows the law, but there's a love for the law that comes with understanding. So they love the law because the law is explained, right? So if you think of, I think it's in the book of Psalms, which points to Jesus saying, I delight to do thy will, O God, thy law is in my heart. And that was pointing to Jesus, right? That was David, I think, who said it, but it's pointing to Jesus. And what it's pointing to is not just an experience that Jesus was going to have, but an experience that a lot of people, I'd say, were going to have. They were going to recognize the fulfillment of the Old Testament and the fulfillment of it, which, forces you, shows you the principles behind what these prophecies were pointing to, gives an experience at the end that could never have been had at the beginning. So I know I said a lot there. If I summarize, I'm saying Jeremiah spoke of the new covenant, and the new covenant did begin at the end of the 70 years, as Jeremiah predicted. But the way it was fulfilled was not as nice as the words seem to suggest, right? What happened is they were forced to pay attention to the law because they hadn't been paying attention to it before under the time of the kings. So they were forced by the circumstances to pay attention. And the net effect of paying attention is by the time things were now happening, fulfilling, coming to completion, because the law was in the forefront, you were going to have people that recognized it. And as the law was explained, you were going to have people that love it. And it's at the end that people genuinely have that experience of the new covenant, which is the law in the heart and mind, the law loved, because the law is understood. And all that being said, again, the emphasis is not so much individuals, but it's a collective experience that God's people were going to have. Collectively, they were going to understand the law. How much each person was going to be benefited by that understanding was going to differ based on their talents, like I said, how close they are to God, I'll say. But if you're going to put a general rule that applies to this setup, it's not a setup where you're going to have a misunderstanding of law and unrighteous application of law. Because what you had after the exiles, after the captivity, sorry, is yes, a knowledge of the law is at the forefront, but there was still unrighteousness in its application. So you were not going to have unrighteousness in its application at the end. Have people followed that history that I've laid out, the timeline for the Old and the New Covenant, ancient Israel?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So the last section of my study with you today is an application, because I want to apply this to modern Israel, because we've been talking about ancient Israel all this time. And I'm going to apply everything that we've discussed together up to this point to Adventism, which is modern Israel. So now we are switching gears and moving to Adventism, because Adventism is who we really care about. Right. So what I'll do is I'll throw a timeline again, similar to the one up here. Okay, so the beginning of modern Israel, Alpha history, which would correspond with Sinai, where you have the two tables given, is 1798 to 1863, which is the history of the Millerites, right? So the messages of 1840 to 44 written on these charts. These are the two tables of Habakkuk that the Millerites, right? And I'm saying this is the beginning of the Old Covenant. This is the Old Covenant for Adventism or covenant, right? And this covenant will follow the rules of the covenant for ancient Israel, and it will extend up to the close of probation. And what I mean by close of probation here is the Sunday law. Because I'm saying the close of probation for the church, right? For the institution of the church, without getting into too much detail. So 34 AD represented the Sunday law for our time. So that's what I mean when I say that. Right? Just to be clear. So this old covenant is going to inform God's people's understanding and their experience until you get to the Sunday law. So that's history number one, which I'm saying corresponds with Sinai. Then the history where God's people come out of Babylon, which is the second history. God's people come out of Babylon in 1844. So there's overlaps, which I will not explain for the sake of time, but there's overlaps, right? What was sequential in the past ends up being concurrent at the end, but we're not going to get into the details of that. So we normally refer to this history as the 1888 history, right? The history of the third angel's message and how it swells into a loud cry. Begins in 1844, when God's people are separated from the Protestants and they're a standalone entity, a standalone church, right? So I don't have a date there. It's not really important end date. And then of course this last history begins 1989. So this is things we already know. And this is the history of the 144,000. Right? So the new covenant for Adventism actually begins right here in 1844 with the rise of the third angel's message. The new covenant begins and is going to extend all the way to here. Right. So there's implications for this that we are going to begin to lay out, I suppose. So note down the properties or characteristics of the old covenant for Adventism.
Leslie,
Yes.
why does the new covenant start there and then God raise up a prophet? And you said before that in the new covenant, it's not like that. Don't need a mediator.
Yes, please write that question down if you can.